All right, so let's get into chapter 11. So, health psychology is the branch of psychology that investigates those psychological factors that relate to an individual's overall wellness, including preventative measures, diagnosis, and treatment of medical problems. So, they look at the overall health of your body, your mind, your social, and that is what makes up the whole of health psychology. So let's start with talking about stress. Everyone experiences stress in some form at one point or another in our lives. And stress is an individual's response to any events that are threatening or challenging. So, a stressor is any event or circumstances that produces threats to our overall well being. And this can be any number of things from sitting in traffic to preparing for an upcoming exam to losing a job, or, of course, as we've all experienced this year, being worried about a pandemic. And it can even include pleasant things. So think about if you're planning a really big party, even though that's really fun and you can't wait for the party, it can also produce some levels of stress. But all of these are pretty personal on some level. Depending on who is experiencing the event, it will determine whether or not it is quote unquote stressful. In other words, for some events are stressful to others, but not to other individuals. So some people will experience stress, for example, when giving a presentation in front of a large group of people. That would really stress a lot of individuals out, right? You might get very nervous about it. You don't really want to do it. But for others, it isn't stressful at all, and they actually really enjoy it. So it really depends on the person and their experiences on whether or not something is going to prove stressful to them. Stress, especially long term stress, can result in serious health issues, both physical and psychological. So, some examples of physical issues you can experience from stress is high blood pressure, headaches, backaches, skin rashes, indigestion, fatigue, and many others. Some psychological issues people can experience are, for example, being unable to adequately cope with stress, which we'll talk about various coping strategies in a little bit. Having an overall negative view of the world and experiencing extreme emotional responses. So, beyond that, which may be warranted for the situation. So, stressors can be categorized into three main groups. We have cataclysmic events, personal stressors, and background stressors. First, we have cataclysmic events, and these are strong stressors that occur suddenly and typically affect many people simultaneously, so at the same time. Examples of these can be tornadoes, earthquakes, plane crashes, wildfires, and perhaps even a pandemic. Cataclysmic effects such as earthquakes or tornadoes often do not produce lingering stress, as they often have an end or some clear resolution after which people can sort of start to rebuild their lives and move on. But other cataclysmic events may have no end point or no end in sight and can produce considerably long term stress. For example, a pandemic, right? So it's been over a year, and even though things are starting to look a little better, we still don't really know how or if we will ever go back to quote unquote normal as we knew it pre pandemic, right? So there's no real end or date for when this will end. It's sort of ongoing. Additionally, overexposure to these events through, for example, media and the news can heighten our level of stress surrounding these events. Next, we have what are called personal stressors. So these are major life events that produce immediate consequences that fade with time. So, for example, the death of a family member, serving in a war, losing a job, or even positive things such as getting married or giving birth. Some individuals that have experienced more catastrophic stressors, personal stressors, have long lasting effects of these events. And this is known as post traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. These individuals may experience or re experience the stressful event through vivid flashbacks or dreams. And we see this a lot with war veterans and also individuals who experience severe childhood abuse or even rescue workers in really stressful situations or individuals who have experienced sudden natural disasters. So, some symptoms of PTSD include difficulty sleeping, alcohol and drug abuse, emotional numbing, and interpersonal issues. And even in some cases, sadly, it results in suicide. About 10 to 18% of war veterans who have returned from Iraq and Afghanistan have shown symptoms of PTSD, which is still something as a country we haven't really been able to provide enough help for. Too many veterans are coming home without the skills to cope with what they have experienced, as well as their new transition back to normal life. And we don't have a really good support system set up for them. We haven't done a great job of that. So this has become an increasing problem that people are becoming more and more aware of. And hopefully we can continue to address this moving forward. And finally, we have what are called background stressors. So these are everyday annoyances that cause minor irritations of some kind. So by themselves, they often don't require much coping skill or even a response of any kind. However, if they're continuous or compounded by other stressful events, they can result in long-term ill effects. An example of a short term background stressor would be perhaps getting stuck in traffic, especially if you're late to work or something like that. Whereas a long term background stressor might be dissatisfaction with a job or being in an unhappy relationship. Now, there are what we call uplifts, which are minor positive events that make you feel good. The more uplifts we experience, the fewer psychological symptoms we tend to experience or tend to report. Now, long term exposure to stress can result in a variety of symptoms, such as decline in physical health, a decline in mental or emotional health, and can even increase the likelihood of becoming ill. So, the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS, is one model that demonstrates the course of these effects of long term stress that they can have on individuals. And this model suggests that there are three stages of a person's response to stressors in their life. So, the first is alarm and mobilization. In this stage, you're aware of the stressor and your sympathetic nervous system is activated. So, this is what helps you cope with this stressor, the activation of the SNS, okay, in this first stage. However, if your stressor persists and you're unable to remove or cope with that stressor in the first stage, you move into the second stage, which is known as resistance. In this stage, the body is actively fighting the stressor at a biological level. So there are many different ways to cope with the stressor in this stage, but it usually is at the detriment of your physical or psychological well-being. So for example, a student who is at risk of failing a few classes may not sleep for several days trying to study and make up assignments to pass the courses. So their body is sort of keeping them awake, right? Adrenaline might be coursing and things like that. But this can result in severe exhaustion and possibly even illness. So you may be able to cope with stressors in this stage, but it is going to come at the risk of some physical or psychological, your own well being. If your resistance fails, so if you fail again to cope with the stressor in this stage, you move into the third stage of exhaustion. So during this stage, your resistance essentially begins to fail, and your ability to fight the stressor in any successful way begins to decline. You can start seeing some negative outcomes, such as heightened irritability or inability to concentrate. So, how do you get out of this third stage, if you no longer are able or if your resistance is declined so much that you can't deal with the stressor. Well, for some people and for most people who reach this stage, it results in sort of a forced escape of the stressor. So, for example, if you're stressed at work, okay, your job is creating a lot of stress, and you reach this level of exhaustion, you may become ill, and you're therefore not able to attend work for a period of time. Obviously, this results in removing the stressor from your life. Here is one's resistance represented on a graph over time. So as you can see, over time, as you experience the stressor through each of these stages, your resistance increases and decreases depending on the stage that you're in. So in the alarm stage, your resistance starts to increase and it reaches a peak in the resistance stage. And then moving into the exhaustion stage, your resistance begins to decline. So this is just sort of a graphical representation of the model we were just talking about. Contemporary health psychologists have taken a slightly broader approach by looking at the main effects of stress. And they have identified three main consequences of stress or long term effects of stress. The first being direct physiological effects. So, this is where individuals might experience things like elevated blood pressure, a decrease in their immune system functioning, maybe increased hormonal activities, and even experiencing various psychophysiological conditions, which are physical and psychological. The second consequence of long term stress, according to this model, are harmful behaviors that individuals engage in as a result of their experiencing stress. So, this may include an increase in smoking, an increase in alcohol or drug use, decreased appropriate nutrition, and even decreased sleep or amount of sleep. And finally, the third consequence of stress is the indirect health related behavior individuals engage in. So these can be things like decreased compliance with medical advice. So maybe an individual continues smoking even after they've been told not to, or they might not take their medication that they've been told to take, and so on. We also might see an increase in delays in seeking medical care. So, if they're ill or not doing well, they may not actually seek out medical care for a long period of time. And we may even see a decrease in the likelihood of seeking medical advice altogether. So, stress can really have detrimental effects, especially if individuals are not only engaging in harmful behaviors, but are actively ignoring medical advice.